Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever it is, wherever you are. Thanks for joining us for this Zehr Institute webinar, our final one of this fall 2024 season. We're really excited today to have friends and colleagues, Mikayla and Rachel, with us to have some conversation about the new little book that they wrote and was recently published, the Little Book of Restorative Justice for Campus Sexual Harms, a holistic approach for colleges and universities to address sexual misconduct and relationship violence. In a second here, I will turn it over to our host, Aaron Bremer. But first, I want to give you a sense of what we'll do during the next 90 minutes or so. Aaron will introduce our topic and our guest speakers. Mikayla and Rachel will then have a presentation and some information, some content for us. And then Aaron will moderate a time for questions and answers. All that to say, feel free to put, as we go throughout the presentation, feel free to add your questions, your comments in the comments section of the platform that you're watching from, and we'll make sure to address those as they come through. We may save most of them for the question and answer time, but feel free to add them at any point. Then we'll have a few announcements, and we will send you off to the rest of your days. So I want to invite Aaron to join us and introduce our speakers.
Thanks, John. Thanks for the intro, and thanks for doing tech for us today. Hi, everyone. It's lovely to be here. So today we're really fortunate that Rachel Roth-Sawatsky and Mikayla W.C. McCrae are sharing their time and energy with us here. Mikayla served as an assistant director of student accountability and restorative justice while supporting students as a residence director. In addition to working in higher education, she is a trained rape crisis counselor, an advocate for restorative justice in the context of domestic violence, dating violence, and sexual violence. She also helped launch and train facilitators for a restorative justice diversion program in Charlottesville and Albemarle County. Welcome, Mikayla. And we also have Rachel, who has worked in a variety of student affairs roles and as a university Title IX coordinator. She now consults with faculty and staff leaders and assists academic units as they holistically respond to sexual misconduct in their communities. She has a lot of experience within foster care and adoption systems, working with children, families, and students impacted by sexual violence. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here. And I am going to turn it over to you to present your content.
Thanks, Aaron. Hi, everyone. So, Rachel, I don't know if you're on mute or if you're good. Okay, cool. So we wanted to start with a little story from our book and give you a little overview of what we're going to go over, and then ask you all a question. But I'll let Rachel start with our excerpt.
A group of students expresses feelings ranging from annoyance to fear as they meet with their club advisor over the increasingly concerning language and behavior of another student who's very focused on interacting and engaging with them. So far, the interactions have mostly been awkward, irritating, and uncomfortable. However, the content, frequency, and intensity of the advances are starting to feel like sexual harassment, and the student group is beginning to feel anxious and worried about their safety. The students consider their advisor's suggestion to report to the Title IX office. However, they are concerned about a potentially biased or disproportionate response because everyone involved, including the student making them uncomfortable, comes from various historically marginalized identity groups. They tell their advisor how the university has responded poorly in similar situations. The students decide against making a Title IX complaint, saying, "We don't want a whole big thing, or for them to get in trouble. We just want it to stop." Now the advisor must make the difficult choice about whether to make a report to the Title IX office with or without the knowledge and consent of the involved students knowing how that could potentially impact them and the student causing harm. The advisor also weighs what might happen if they do nothing and feels they do not have any good options.
Thank you, Rachel. And thank you to the Zehr Institute and Aaron and John for hosting us. So for today, we'll be using our books as reference. So if you see us looking down or off to the side, we'll probably just be checking in for notes. And if you have your own copy, you're welcome to follow along with us. So we'll be introducing a little bit about Title IX, just the basics, restorative justice for sexual misconduct, like implementation program and recommendations, and we'll have some time for questions at the end, as John mentioned. So we've got a couple of prompts for participants if you wanted to drop the response in the comments section, but we just kind of wanted to know who's in the room and where you're coming from. And then a little later on, I think we'll ask you about like kind of what brings you here specifically to this work and this session. So Rachel and I began our collaboration at EMU by working on a committee examining policies around sexual misconduct and their impact on student well-being. Rachel was the Title IX coordinator at the time, and I was serving as the assistant director of restorative justice and student accountability. The committee proposed developing an additional approach to existing traditional institutional procedures, including those that comply with the federal law known as Title IX processes, that could address the needs that emerge for individuals impacted by campus RVSM, or relationship violence and sexual misconduct. And this proposal aligned well with our shared interests, through which we had some questions emerge. We were wondering, have our federally compliant institutional policies been asked to do more than they were designed to do in the first place? And are there ways to comply with policy and law and be compassionate in addressing the harms and needs that students and others experience because of RVSM? So that's a little bit about what brought us together, what brought us into our work. We'd love to hear your interest in the topic and what brings you to this work. Feel free to drop that in the comments and we'll read it. Thanks for sharing with us. So we wanted to name that Restorative Justice asks, given the harms, what needs and obligations now exist? RJ for sexual misconduct provides a voluntary and structured way of involving directly affected individuals, including the person harmed and the person who caused harm, in a process designed to discern and meet the needs of the person harmed to the extent possible, given the circumstances, and to prevent future misconduct. And while it's a focus on the folks who are directly involved and impacted, we also, when designing the RJSM approach, wanted to recognize that there are all kinds of broader factors that create impacts and that are the initial causes for some of the harms experienced. And so we talk about how we work directly with individuals and as broadly as communities and institutions as we can manage to make sure that we're preventing future harm and future misconduct as much as possible. And this is done through an institutionally supported collaboration, resulting in a resolution agreement that addresses the harmful or prohibited conduct and provides accountability for the harm without formal disciplinary measures. So that's what we're hoping for. So this is a quote from Dr. Fani Davis, who is well known in the restorative justice and education world, particularly for founding RJOY, Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth. She says that healers and warriors are not opposites. They are complementary. Moving beyond binaries, we need not embrace one and reject the other. We can hold them both as one. So restorative justice is grounded in deep wisdom that echoes recognizable values, ideals, and practices of Indigenous communities, cultures worldwide, including Aotearoa, New Zealand, and a variety of African and Polynesian groups, among others. We offer our humble recognition and deepest gratitude to the groups who claim these traditions and philosophies as part of their people's stories, heritage, or legacy. Our work is further grounded in the wisdom of specific mentors, scholars, and practitioners who have come before us, including Sujata Baliga, Angela Davis, Fania Davis, Howard Zehr, and many more. And I feel a particular kinship with Dr. Fania Davis, as she is one of my mentors. So I'm happy to be a part of this little legacy.
So we're going to just give you a quick primer on Title IX, because that's the context that Mikayla and I work in the United States. But as I was looking at who all has joined us, just recognizing that there are folks from all around the world on the call with us today, which is fantastic, as well as different types of institutions. So I was seeing a DA's office and various universities across the US, Canada, New Zealand. I'm sure there were others, but I wasn't able to keep track of all of the folks as they were sharing where they were from. But there were also some victims groups, some other advocacy types of things. And so even medical centers, community RJ centers, that kind of thing. So recognizing that our context is US higher ed, and there are certain laws that govern how institutions respond to sexual misconduct that they become aware of. That's sort of the context for this. But we also want to say that there are a lot of principles here which can be applied around the world. Around the world, there are local laws, and institutions have policies that are guiding how we interact with one another and setting expectations and holding us accountable to those. So just wanting to put that sort of explanation around the very specific context we are functioning in. So Title IX is a US federal law that prohibits sex discrimination in education. And reading from the book, pages 15 to 16, a snapshot overview of a standard procedure goes as follows. When the Title IX office receives notice of a potential policy violation, a prompt and equitable response is required. The report is reviewed to assess a number of factors, including the type of behavior, who is involved, where it occurred, and the context in which it happened. Based on the answers to these questions, an investigation is initiated. There may be an adjudicated hearing in which the investigative report, relevant testimony, and evidence are considered to determine if a policy violation occurred, after which a finding of responsible or not responsible is issued according to the institution's standard of proof. For example, preponderance of the evidence, which would be 50% plus, or a clear and convincing standard, which is 100%. If applicable, remedies and sanctions are determined, and then optional rounds of appeals processes follow. That's sort of our institutional status quo, in the United States in higher ed. So what we just want to say is that Title IX was designed for a very specific purpose, and to those ends, it has been tremendously successful in legislating gender equity in US higher ed. But we see real complexities in balancing fairness, equity, harm reduction, and institutional responsibility in its implementation and enforcement. From our perspective, we are asking Title IX to do things it wasn't intended to do. So again, reading from pages 11 to 12, our status quo response methods are not very nimble or able to attune to situational nuance, including the variety of individual, collective, and cultural identities we have and how they overlap to shape our experiences in the world. This is because the standard policies and procedures to address these situational nuances need frameworks and tools to meaningfully address the causes and effects of these harmful situations, as well as to address individual and collective responsibility in these situations, which Title IX cannot do. So our concerns are not specifically around Title IX. Title IX just should be lauded for so many ways, for its the ways that it has advanced equity for in gender in the U.S. higher ed system. However, it's misapplied in many situations to sexual misconduct. Title IX investigations in sexual misconduct cases often add insult to injury for individuals who have experienced harm. They are often challenged to be trauma informed. And they are challenged to offer procedural safeguards for people alleged to have caused harm. The due process concerns really kick in. Schools also are not equipped typically to handle quasi-judicial processes for sexual assault and harassment cases, and it leaves open the possibility for overreach by universities. A second set of concerns that we have is both the scope and the vagueness of Title IX. Changes in Title IX enforcement priorities with each administration has created real instability for schools, and it results in a lot of confusion for students, faculty, staff, and administrators. Ironically, at the same time, Title IX is overly prescriptive, attempting to apply a one-size-fits-all kind of solution in cases which involve endless varieties of nuance. And the third concern that we have, sort of cluster of concerns we have, is a focus on compliance over culture. Some schools focus on meeting minimum compliance standards rather than at the cost of fostering genuine culture change and around gender equity, so that compliance with Title IX can become a box-checking activity designed to mitigate institutional liability at the expense of addressing harms, meeting needs, and working at holistically addressing institutional cultural issues. So this figure is on page 60 in the book. So we're now wanting to say that in addition to Title IX, so we need to have Title IX investigative adjudicatory processes. They are important, and they are what some folks need and what some situations require. But there are other cases, many cases, which would benefit from additional flexibility and additional ways of addressing the harms and needs. So there's no one right way to do this. RJ for sexual misconduct is highly customizable to campus conditions, the partners that are involved, resources, and relevant law and policy. But there are a number of best practice criteria that are critical to highlight. First is alignment. Policy and potential law will indicate the types of cases that are eligible for referral to RJ for sexual misconduct. Second, staffing. The RJ facilitators or coordinators must be qualified, they must be trained, and they must possess the ability to be multi-partial in each case, or in the cases that they are assigned to. The third important factor is consent and voluntariness. The very first rule of thumb in working with people who've been harmed and the people who have caused harm is that voluntary consent to participate must be given, and it must be demonstrated ongoing with willingness to collaborate throughout. Equity. The RJ for sexual misconduct process can be carried out equitably for all parties involved, considering power dynamics, identities, and other relevant factors. We'll return to this point later, but that must be considered and assured. Meaningful accountability is another piece that RJ for sexual misconduct needs to consider. RJ for sexual misconduct requires a baseline recognition of the general substance of the harm caused and experienced, even if there's no agreed upon narrative or a capital T shared truth agreed to by all. This is a tricky one to thread the needle on. We can talk about it more at the end if there's interest, but there needs to be some agreement of by all parties to the harm that was caused. And then safety. Potential safety concerns have to have been assessed and those concerns adequately addressed. And finally, support. The folks who are facilitating a process, an RJ for sexual misconduct process, are not counselors. They are there for a specific purpose. And so just making sure that they can stay in their lane and do their work requires that we have additional support structures in place and at the ready, such as counseling and other services available for both the person harmed and the person who caused harm before, during, and after the process.
Sorry, I was on mute there. Yes, and thank you, Rachel. And just like Rachel was saying, for how to create the structure and the process for doing an RJ for SM kind of approach, this is a graphic for what the intake meeting might look like It's on page 68 if you're following along. I'll give you just a second to read that. So this is particularly helpful when we're talking about setting expectations. Setting expectations not just for the folks who will be directly participating, but also for any relevant administrators and faculty and staff who need to be consulted for creating and implementing an RJSM approach. Like Rachel was saying, the Title IX coordinator is someone critical to the process who must be on board. And this information here is a helpful guide for how you might steer the conversation with the Title IX office and anyone who's doing like student accountability or compliance. And it's helpful, but in its most practical form, the reason that we put it here was for doing pre-meetings and initial discussions with folks who are interested in doing an RJ for SM process. And so when we look at the things mentioned here, it highlights that there might be some questions, some questions that you might not think of, or some questions that you might not have the answers to when you're first proposing an RJSM process. For example, what if either party wants to discontinue? They've decided that they want to go and do an RJSM, but as they're moving through the steps, they recognize that they actually would maybe prefer to do an investigative adjudicatory process. And so we have some recommendations for that, like they're able to shift to an IA resolution process up to the point of signing the final RJSM resolution agreement. And in that case, the Title IX IA process would start all over again. So any information obtained during the RJ portion cannot be used in any other university or legal process. And that's something just that we recommend, but it's a question that your Title IX coordinator might have, or that student participants might have, like, okay, is this information going to be quote unquote used against me, or can I use it in a different procedure, like resolution option that I want to pursue? And this is always going to be based on campus culture, other institutional policies, relevant state laws, and schools need to make some additional decisions for themselves about what makes sense and what's applicable and what's not, as well as if there will be restorative practices and options made available after a Title IX investigative adjudicatory process. So they might say, like, okay, I wanted to go through the IA process, but as far as determining outcomes, I still want to do something that was more restorative, or we as a community think it's important to involve other parties in deciding how best to continue afterwards. And that might look like sentencing circles or circles of support and accountability. And this is all very specific, can be tailored to each situation, each institution, each process. And the follow-up steps for like another question might be, what if we can't reach a resolution agreement, or we get to a resolution agreement, but then the actual steps agreed to don't happen? What then? And that's something that you can decide as an institution and as an office with all of the relevant administrators. And so while it can be a little like nerve-wracking thinking about, well, how do we create something that's so different from Title IX, or how do we create something that's supposed to work alongside Title IX but doesn't have a clear set of guidelines? And so what we're recommending is recognizing that there's a lot of different ways that this can be implemented and adapted and shifted and changed over and over again, which actually brings me to the next slide. You may have seen these restorative questions. They're on page 70 of the book. I'll give you a second to read them. So when Rachel and I were presenting about the book at a conference, someone came up to us afterwards and they said, when I do these questions, I don't separate them by person harmed, person who caused harm. I just ask all of the questions to all of the participants. And I think the only one that would need to be maybe changed is the last question into something like, given what has happened, what do you believe must be done for things to be made as right as possible? But I bring this up to say that we're always teachers and we're always learners, and that the need for flexibility is what makes restorative justice for sexual misconduct a unique approach, because it does invite all of the nuance and nimbleness necessary to help address needs as thoroughly as possible. And it's just to say that the first iteration that you come up with might not be the one that you end up with. And that is due to continuing to get feedback and doing evaluation. So one of the things that we emphasize in the book that we really hammer home is the need for feedback and evaluation. Literally getting feedback before you even start. How are you engaging the community? How are you talking to graduate students, first-year students, faculty, staff, anyone who might be impacted, particularly impacted communities like are the folks who participate in sports going to the Title IX office more than other groups of students, that kind of thing. Getting their feedback and their input before you even begin the actual implementation process, and then continuing to get feedback and evaluation through the pre-meetings and pre-conferencing, the actual process itself, and afterwards for any sort of follow-up. So that's one of the best practices that we recommend, is evaluation and feedback, so that you're aware of what you know and you're aware of what you don't know. It's helpful to be able to lean into what's working and what you want to continue to replicate, as well as recognizing, what things are we doing that maybe aren't as helpful or are potentially causing similar harms. And, there was something I wanted to say when I brought this up. No, I was really excited about it. Oh, right. And bringing it up back to the Title IX coordinator and relevant administration. If you have information and you've gotten your feedback and your evaluation sheets and your recommendation forms and whatnot from the participants and from relevant community members, then when they ask, well, what is this really going to look like? And what is the value of this program? Or what's the value of continuing to implement and utilize these like augmentations to Title IX? You can point to all of the data that you've gathered to say, this is the value. This is what we're seeing as positive impacts or as reducing harm. So that's, like I said, one of the best practices. Some other ones that we highlight are honoring individual agency. So this is page 77. If you've worked with folks who have experienced RVSM, then you probably have heard about how important it is to honor agency and rebuild agency and autonomy for folks who have experienced harm. And if you've worked exclusively in restorative justice for other kinds of harms, then I'm also sure that you've heard about the importance of honoring agency and the ways that agency building and autonomy building present themselves in RVSM situations is unique. So the ways that you might create that autonomy are through like offering virtual or in-person meeting formats, letting individuals know that they are welcome to but don't have to bring a support person or support persons with them, having several meeting options and inviting individuals to sit wherever they are most comfortable. You might have heard, if you have a counseling background, you might have seen or done this practice as well. And basic things like asking before closing the office door. Is it okay with you if we shut the door? Would you rather I leave it open? What's the balance between safety and privacy in that situation? And you get to decide, and based on what you need, we're going to adapt our process, and we're going to adapt all of the pieces of our process for that. We also recommend inviting reflective engagement. So this is a helpful practice for respecting participants' agency and moving the process forward through reflection, both for the folks who are in the process and for the facilitator, reflecting back what you're hearing, asking relevant questions, learning to ask relevant open-ended questions to inspire reflection and respond in open and empathic ways, or help facilitate responses that are open and empathic, because really what we're trying to do is build a container where accountability can take place and justice can be sought in ways that feel authentic and helpful. So offering empathetic support while maintaining one's own personal boundaries and self-awareness is a bit of a dance. And that's where the practice of multi-partiality is also one of the more important features of an RJSM model. It's useful for discussions among individuals from diverse social identity groups as it aims to foster connections across disparities, because multi-partiality is just acknowledging that individual truths, perspectives, needs, and non-negotiables are valid and may differ from others because individual perspectives are socially and experientially influenced. So it's just recognizing that all of your truths and all of your lived realities and lived experiences are critically important to this process and are an important thing for us to recognize and continue to lean into. And again, that goes back to getting feedback and evaluation, checking and rechecking in that we are leaning into a multi-partial reflective engagement, honoring agency type practices. And then generally speaking, understanding the impact of sexual harm and trauma. Like I said, if you've worked with folks who've been through RVSM, you probably have a specific set of skills, as well as RJ practitioners have their own specific set of skills. And there are ways that sexual harm and trauma in particular can affect persons harmed that are perhaps unexpected and can require some additional nuance and practice and a slower approach. And then as one of the biggest best practices we try to emphasize and encourage is whatever you do, however you create your program and your process, it should have an emphasis on reducing racial and ethnic disparities, or RED. And we emphasize this because, statistically speaking, if you don't have a structure in place designed to reduce racial and ethnic disparities, there will be racial and ethnic disparities. And this is regardless of best intentions. If there's not a plan in place, then it's very easy for those patterns to assert themselves into a process. And then the folks who are getting help, who are getting the opportunity to go through an RJSM process, might be the same kind of folks who are being regularly harmed. So and finally, the last thing I wanted to name here on this slide was, do RJ for sexual misconduct offices coordinate or cooperate with law enforcement offices? So we were talking about kind of the questions that might come up when you're developing a program and deciding on what to do in resolution agreements, after resolution agreements. And so we're going to answer that the same way we kind of said about everything else. It's important to work with your community and to get a read on what makes sense for the environment that you're creating your process in. And it's important to acknowledge that if inside of any other institution, there's going to be a minimizing of your ability to be flexible and nuanced. So if the local law enforcement come and take over a process, that eliminates different levels of agency and flexibility and situational responsiveness that may have otherwise existed had it stayed within the university context. So that's something to be mindful of. And it's not to say that could there be a system in place where a student or a faculty or staff member is involved in a legal incident, and then the local law enforcement call the university and say, hey, can I drop this person off at the RJSM office? That would be amazing. But it is to say, if they do take over the process, then that really limits the options and ability to kind of be as responsive as we recommend being, or as flexible as is like advisable for the process.
So there are lots of questions that are out there. One that I saw in the chat, and then we'll turn to this slide, but maybe start with how do you communicate that someone might shift to an investigative process without being coercive? I'm assuming that you're talking about sharing with the person who caused harm. You're wanting to be transparent to them that this could pivot to an investigative process. And so you're wanting to be both transparent but not coercive and trying to get them to be cooperative. I think that's the question. So Mikayla, I don't know if you want to answer that. I would begin by just saying it's all about pre-conferencing. Like, before you begin any kind of conferencing or negotiating, going back and forth between the parties, or whatever tool is selected to meet, to like facilitate the dialogue, you have done a lot of groundwork. And part of that is making sure everybody understands their options, the potential, like the flow of the process, where there are opportunities to step out, that kind of thing. So I think it's all about the pre-conferencing and making sure that folks really understand what's going on. Mikayla, do you have anything you would want to contribute to that?
Well, I was thinking about, we say somewhere in the book, like one of the truths about a Title IX process is that technically no one has to participate. Like, after the complaint is filed, everyone can, or just one person, or just one person can participate. And so kind of just acknowledging that's while someone might want to shift to another process, there's still like the fact that they might not have as much participation in the process. It's like something worth communicating as well. Just like you said, being as transparent about what could come up, what will happen, and that there are places that can be like where there can be like pause and like reassessment.
Right. Yeah. Like, you are checking, the facilitator is checking with both parties or all parties throughout to make sure we're all still on board. We're still, engaged. We're still ready to work at this. We're demonstrating on an ongoing basis our willingness to participate. So, that's a big part of it. So, of our prepared questions here, I'm going to begin by asking Mikayla, can you use this process in all kinds of harm? What about cases of, for example, sexual assault?
Yes, this is a question that comes up. and so what we talk about on page 60 in chapter 6 under our RJ hallmark criteria is, like, first and foremost, federal and state law as well as university policy will indicate the types of cases that are eligible for referral for RJSM. And second, the person harmed and the person who caused harm must give voluntary consent to participate and actively engage with an authentic intention to repair harm. And like you mentioned earlier, Rachel, like, there must be a baseline recognition of the general substance of the harm caused and experienced, even if there is no capital T agreed upon truth. And so the answer is, with those pieces in mind, yes, it is something that can be used for all kinds of harms and in all kinds of cases. And this question sometimes can come from a rather like paternalistic standpoint that has prevailed in domestic violence and sexual violence communities sometimes, like the idea that like, oh, survivors couldn't possibly want that, or they couldn't possibly be able to navigate something like that well. So we have to protect them and limit choice in ways that keep them safe. And recognizing that justice is what the survivor or what the person harmed says it is. And that justice is created with the person harmed and the person who caused harm and their community members, so that it can be addressed in a way that feels purposeful, authentic, and helpful. So, Rachel, what about sexual misconduct that doesn't rise to the level of a Title IX violation?
Yes, so this can be applied as, an option that somebody might select for resolving a specific complaint that could potentially meet the criteria of a Title IX violation or a violation of another policy that the institution has. But there are tons of things that are not okay that happen in our daily interactions that don't meet the standard of a law that's been broken or a policy that's been broken. And so RJ for sexual misconduct is very well applied in those cases. And we will actually, I'm going to defer on this one to our next slide, where we talk about tiers of applying RJ for sexual misconduct at several tiers. And I think it will address that. But to say that what we are talking about is a tier 2 intervention that is an option for resolving a specific named issue between parties as an alternative that's been selected to another formal institutional process. So we will, it is very applicable and helpful many times in cases that don't rise to the level of or don't meet certain definitions, but we'll get there. So Mikayla, what's the difference between this and mediation? A lot of folks say mediation isn't appropriate for sexual harm, but this can sound like mediation. What are we talking about here?
That's a great question. So one of the standard premises of mediation is that folks are the folks are coming from like equal footing, or that they are on level ground as far as power is concerned, and that can be a premise that creates more harm in its application. So some things that distinguish restorative justice from mediation are that restorative justice necessitates the acknowledgement of harm and responsibility, and it tries to account for various power dynamics between the parties or among the parties, and requires extensive pre-conferencing preparation between the facilitator and the parties involved, as well as the fact that restorative justice processes try to consider community or institutional factors that may have a stake of some kind in the resolution. And so it's not to say that there isn't a particular kind of adapted mediation that could potentially incorporate some of those elements, or all of those elements, to create something that is suitable, or at least is a good like entry point. But with a general understanding of the basic premise of mediation, it's not necessarily a good fit for this kind of harm. So Rachel, could you talk to us a little bit about restorative justice in Title IX, like 2020 regulations versus the 2024 regulations, and like what's next in light of new election results and realities?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so 2020, we talk about it in the book, so I don't want to go into it a whole lot here, and recognizing there are a lot of folks who are outside of the U.S. context in our meeting today. But for those who are in U.S. higher ed and other K-12 situations, there were changes to the federal regs in 2020 that allowed for the formal, for formal processes using restorative justice to be implemented at in educational settings. So that actually is what prompted this book. And then 2024 came, the Biden administration passed 2024 regs, which did a little bit of tweaking to the 2020 regs. There tends to be sort of this pendulum swing, as I mentioned earlier, between different administrations' sort of agenda, social agenda, a lot of times. The big, so I do feel like we sort of go back and forth between things. Now that the Trump administration is going to be back in office, there are institutions across the US that did go ahead and implement a new set of policies for their institutions that were compliant with 2024. And it sort of remains to be seen. I don't think that based on what we've seen from the Trump administration in the past, that they will sort of say, do what you want. If you want to do 24, that's fine. If you want to do 2020, that's fine. I have a feeling that they might just say, we're doing 2020. So those schools that didn't convert yet to 24 are probably in a less chaotic place than those who converted to 2020, then converted to 2024, and will likely have to go back to 2020. But a lot of that is speculation. And I think, it just sort of remains to be seen what the Trump administration does. What we know about the 2020 regs is that they allowed for RJ to be a part of formal institutional processes. So that's what we will hope will remain in effect. And given the track record, I think we can safely assume that will continue to be an option for us. So how do you address intersectional harms? How do you address intersectional harms or intersectional realities that are factors, dynamics, nuances in sexual harm cases when you're utilizing RJ in these cases, Mikayla?
Yes, that's such a good question. And I think it's one of the beautiful parts of RJSM, like we were talking about kind of the difference between like mediation and restorative justice, processes. One of the things that we can do and should do, I think one of the first steps is just naming that that's a reality, that's potentially something that's a contributing factor, or if it is something that's, what's the word? Obviously a contributing factor, naming that explicitly as well. I was thinking about this situation I had in the past where I was having a meeting with a colleague of mine and we were interviewing someone, and I was the person who was doing the interview and asking the questions. And I recognized that the person I was interviewing kept directing their answers to my colleague. And it was an odd moment because I was clearly the one who was having this conversation, but in that moment I thought to myself, you know what? I wonder if this has something to do with the fact that I haven't been like grounded in this community and in this like institution for a long time. Maybe it's because I have a lack of like understanding and I don't have my roots here. And so recognizing that, like, okay, that could have been one of the realities. And the other reality could have been that I was like the youngest person there. My gender was different from my colleague, and that I was BIPOC and the other folks in the process weren't. But if I'd had the opportunity to address it with the person that I was interviewing, they might have said, you know what, it was absolutely because you're young. I didn't even recognize that this was like an age situation, and that I have a tendency to not have as much interaction with young people as colleagues or as peers. And so we have the opportunity to name that and kind of address it and see, is this something that is just our individual responsibility? Is this something that's just our individual lived realities between me and this person? Or maybe it's a broader reality in the community that this person's a part of, or their department, or their culture. And how do we name that? Yes, this person and I have something that we need to address, and maybe this person has something that they need to address within their broader social cultural groups as well. And that's one of the things that Rachel, I think we'll get into when we get into the tier systems, but that's like one of the most exciting parts about like tier 0 and tier 1 is that we can address those things, name them, and not be afraid of the fact that they do have impacts on what's happening. And the more that we can be aware of that, the more we can address it accurately and help prevent future occurrences.
Mm-hmm. I would also add in this case that where there are other potential civil rights violations occurring, though, there may be other teams on your campuses or other policies that are activated that need to be, applied to a situation. So depending on the type of intersectionality, just being aware that the civil rights team might need to weigh in before or alongside an RJ for sexual misconduct case. Or there might be the disability equity team needs to weigh in on what an appropriate resolution looks like that satisfies their legal obligations to protect the educational experience from discrimination on the basis of disability. So it becomes complicated when these things rise to the level of policy violation that multiple offices have interest or stake in addressing. But it's not impossible. It just means we continue to be nimble and we continue to say, what are the needs and how are we going to be as creative as possible to address as adequately as possible all of the needs and satisfy our own institutional obligations. But at the end of the day, we want to make sure that the people impacted have agency to say what happens with their personal situations. And then the institution needs to make sure that they're crafting policy and procedure that allows that to be okay, where we don't have to overreach or we don't, we meaning institutions, we aren't overreaching into other people's, into individual agency freedom that people should have. So
absolutely. Thank you, Rachel. That was awesome.
So that really helps us get right into our last question, which was situations involving power dynamics, rank, role, tenure, faculty, and staff. In medical centers, this is particularly, tough when there's situations between patients and staff or between, different levels of medical personnel. But Mikayla, I don't know if you have any thoughts to kick this one off.
One of the things that, thank you. So one of the things that I think is, that's important to acknowledge is your community, your institution, your administrators will decide, well, with hopefully lots of impact, lots of input from all of the relevant parties, what kinds of things can proceed, what you all have capacity to handle. But as a system or as a process, there's nothing to say that there cannot be power dynamics accounted for in a process for it to proceed. So if it's usually that you can have a Title IX resolution through for faculty and faculty or for staff and faculty, but not for faculty and staff because of some sort of specific power dynamics that are at play there. We would say that absolutely, this can happen for anybody. It can be faculty and staff, staff and staff, students and staff, or students and faculty if the Title IX regulations permit it. But as a concept, as a process, as a practice, yes, accounting for power dynamics is just an inherent part of it. And if it seems like that is what's going to help everyone move forward and address the harm in the best way possible, we would recommend it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I work at an institution that there's a lot of it's an R1, so there's a lot of like in our engineering departments or in the medical center attached to the university, or there's just so much grad students, their funding, their opportunities for promotion, for advancement in their career, grants, like their position at the their employment is contingent upon someone in position of authority above them. And so when everything is at stake, and then you feel like there's something that has happened that is, it's a misuse of power, it can be terrifying to try and address it because there is so much at stake. And so just wanting to we don't want to be toxically positive about the possibilities that RJ has. We just want to recognize that there are real power differentials and there's a lot at stake for folks. But just as Mikayla said, there's nothing inherent to RJ for sexual misconduct, which says, nope, can't use it between grad students and faculty, or we can't use it when there's an undergrad and a staff person. There's nothing unique about that says RJ can't be used. We can accommodate for those things, but it does get the pre-conferencing just becomes that much more important, and making sure that we are vetting people's willingness well, that we are vetting their sincere willingness to take meaningful accountability. Like all of that is tested, and there are people who are going to try to pull the wool over your eyes or whatever to get out of a process. But also, I would say that the tenure structure makes a lot of, at least on the faculty side, those positions are so secure. There's no incentive to those folks to go through an RJ process unless they really want to make it right. That they would be doing it for the right reasons. Theoretically. So I think, we can account for these things, and as long as we are doing pre-conferencing really well and that kind of thing. But we just wanted to acknowledge that there are real power differentials in our spaces that we are working in, and they can be accommodated for, and their impacts are real, and sort of holding all of that at the same time.
And I think that's the important part of getting feedback from all of the potential impacted parties and all of the people who might participate in an RJSM scenario, because they could tell you, this is the way that I might game this system, or this is the way I might take advantage of it. Maybe we should come up with some counterpoints to prevent that kind of thing.
So that's a great point to pivot to our collective wellness approach, which we are suggesting that what we have been talking about today slots in at the second level there, specific responses to harm. So this is on page 32 in the book, figure 5. The whole campus or school approach brings a public health model to the integration of RJ at all levels of an institution. So the tier 0 the tier 0 substructure considers institutional habits, regularities, traditions that relate to institutional and unit health and well-being, restorative values such as civility, agency, freedom, transparency, collaboration. Tier 0 grounds the relationships at tier 1 within our organizations. Tier 2 shapes the responses that we have to harm, and tier 3 informs learning, growth, change opportunities for the folks involved. So in terms of strategy, what we are actually talking about at Tier 0 is community building efforts, ensuring safe and inclusive spaces, promoting pro-social skills and community norms that are characterized by civility, equity, agency, voice, choice, consent, addressing systemic issues like gender inequality and power imbalance, cultural attitudes that tolerate or normalize sexual misconduct, ensuring that policies and practices are in place to create environments in which misconduct is discouraged, well-being is supported, and pathways for meaningful accountability are provided. At Tier 1, we're working to do proactive education, providing education and training on a variety of topics: consent, healthy relationship skills, bystander intervention, workplace civility. We're training our leaders and our managers and our educators to recognize when there are behaviors that could lead to misconduct and support their willingness to intervene. We are addressing organizational and team and residential and workplace, classroom, medical center climates, which are permissive of power-based harm. And we are designing and holding people accountable to clear expectations within their units, to principles that and practices that require civility, encourage transparency, trust, and accountability. So at Tier 2, that's where we've been at Tier 2 all the way along. And what we are suggesting as well is that you can't, we would suggest that you shouldn't do a Tier 2 unless you have the ability to do a Tier 3. To have a meaningful process, you have to provide opportunities for the harm doer to be reintegrated, and for the person who has experienced harm to also be reintegrated into the educational or work experience that they want. So on both counts, Tier 3 is the integration back into the community for folks who were involved. So a tiered approach is phased, it's highly customizable, it's adaptable, it's responsive to the needs and readiness for doing something like this of the community. It can be employed in the US and in broader global contexts outside of the US. So you don't need to be thinking in terms of Title IX to do this. And then let's see, they are Tier 2 and Tier 3 are ideally developed simultaneously so that we can offer folks, a holistic experience back into the community. All right, Mikayla.
Okay, so I want to make sure to leave some time for questions, but we wanted to talk to you about the promise of RJ for sexual harms in campus context, and just some of the things that we had to remind ourselves of along the way, and that we hope that you can keep in mind as you go forward as well. So start slow and be creative. It was funny when we were getting ready to do this, Rachel and I were looking through the book and found that we say start slow and be creative, not just here, but in like several parts of the book, because it is so important to recognize that you can start right away with Tier 0. You can start community building, assessing, trust building, evaluation right away, because that's going to create the firm foundation and the basis for moving forward. And through that, you can ask yourself, what opportunities already exist? What structures and systems already exist that could be made more restorative? Who are the collaborators that you can come alongside? What are the things that they are already doing, already interested in, already trying to implement right where you are? Be creative and dream. Consider that there have been impacts, and that there are obligations and responsibilities, and that the possibility for addressing those impacts are really only limited to your imagination and the needs of the person harmed. So when you reach a seeming dead end or a place where you're not sure how to move forward, you can always pause and regroup, and then embrace a creativity that looks at the needs of those who stand to gain the most, and engage their questions. So if you find yourself wondering like, how do we move forward from here? It's like, okay, well, let's ask ourselves, who is most impacted? Who would be most impacted if we had this structure in place? Who's already most impacted because we don't have the structure in place? And what do they have to say about it? And how can we be creative and dream up good solutions and good next steps with them? We do recommend that you stray from the beaten path. I promise you, we do not need new versions of the same systems. Systems will replicate themselves without our assistance at all. So when you are thinking about how you can scaffold, structure, restructure, add in, continue to ask yourself, well, what looks different about this? Or what could continue to look different? And what could be unique about this? In what ways do we get to create change? Instead of the idea that like we have to do something about this, we have to address this, we need to do specific kinds of work, and that involves all of this like labor and convincing and potentially difficult implementation process. Instead, ask yourself, what do we now have the opportunity to do because of the position that we're in now? So who do you have to have on board for partnering, and how do you partner with them well so that you can all stray from the beaten path and you can all create something that is genuinely like life-giving and and going to be like an assistance to your community and to all of your impacted folks. So I think we now have time for questions, unless there's something you wanted to add, Rachel.
There's a question in the chat about.
Well, I think we can turn it over to Erin for that if you wanted.
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, we can turn it over to her. I was just gonna add that again, a lot of this is very specific to higher ed settings in the U.S., but that the principles of the tiered approach is can be applied in so many different settings, and that the restorative principles of agency, voice, choice, safety, meaningful accountability, that those restorative principles are can be universally applied in so many different settings. And so I see the question here, how much of the book might be applicable outside of higher ed, like in a prison setting. So I'd love to hear, Mikayla, you respond to that. But I would also say there's a lot of wonderful little books that that I think could really say something to that situation, to a prison setting, for example. So yeah, I don't need to do Erin's job for her. I'll shut up now.
You're on a roll, Rachel. But yeah, Mikayla, respond to that question. You know, how much of this do you feel does apply in other settings, particularly in a prison setting?
Yes. So actually, when we were going through the questions, I was thinking about chapter 6. It's called Essential Components of RJSM Procedures. And I think you can read that as how you would do the RJSM procedures for any institution, in my opinion. I think where we talk about Title IX in the book and the federal regulations that we are talking about in educational environment, I think maybe it would be the PREA standards if it's specifically a prison, and what they would say are best practices for how to do different types of like administrative like approvals through that system. But I do think that a lot of it is broadly applicable to any kind of institution. I think the most like the trickiest part to navigate would be recognizing which federal or institutional policies you'd have to rely on and navigate that are not specifically Title IX.
Yeah, so Greg, refer back to that chapter 6. There was also a question, and I believe this was when you were talking about specific tier 2 processes involving people harmed and people who caused harm. Anita from Houston said, what do opportunities to step out look like in real time to withdraw consent from the process? Is there a signal that's determined in advance? Does this apply to both parties? How do you navigate that?
That's a great question. And it makes me think of, first, it makes me think of what Rachel said about the importance of pre-conferencing and establishing those things early on. But it also makes me think of a scenario where a co-facilitator and I were like doing our like pre-conferencing meetings, and someone said, I really don't want to be yelled at. Can you guarantee that I'm not going to be yelled at? And so we had to navigate kind of expectations around that. Like, well, what do you mean when you say yelled at? Do you mean it would feel uncomfortable for someone to raise their voice at all? Do you mean someone raising their voice at you, maybe saying your name, clearly giving you eye contact? Or maybe the idea that someone is yelling at everybody in the room and now you're like caught up in this scenario? And then deciding, okay, now that we've identified like what yelling means, what do we do in that situation? Would you like to signal to one of us, one of the co-facilitators? Would you like to stand up and stand behind your chair because that feels like you have a little more agency right then for like getting to safety should you need it? Does that mean that we need to put your chair closer to the door so that if there's a situation that arises where you feel like you need to get going, you're close and accessible? And so we had to establish all of that beforehand. And then during the process, it meant that the person felt that they knew exactly how they wanted to address it if it came up, or they could kind of check in with themselves and decide, actually, I'm okay to stay here now and I can talk about it with the facilitators later on. So opportunities to like actually step out in the middle of the process might look like that. And then opportunities to decide to move away from an RJ process and into an investigative adjudicatory process would probably be, I can't imagine that being like a real-time scenario unless again, in pre-conferencing, you decided like, if we get here and this person, so like this is an important thing about like expectation setting. Before you go into a conference, you might say like, the person who caused you harm is willing to acknowledge that there was a harm caused, but like kind of only to a certain extent. Do you still want to go forward with this, or does that not feel good? And you might establish there, like, if they are willing to acknowledge it in as much as, X, Y, and Z, I would stay. But if not, I think I'm going to go ahead and leave. And then when you get to that point in the process, that would be like an opportunity to step out. And that would be an indicator to the co-facilitators to kind of wrap up that session and move on to potentially shifting into a different process. I hope that answers the questions. I might have been a little broad.
Yeah, I was just going to add that there's so many different tools that can be used. And so like a facilitated dialogue in which I sort of imagine that question, that scenario actually happening, that might not be the method. There might have been some shuttle negotiation. So there's one-on-one conversation between the facilitator and each party all the way through. Like that's the only way that this is happening. And so then there's just ongoing conversation, and they can signal at any time in that one-on-one with the facilitator, you know what, this isn't working for me, and I'm done. So that question to me, I hear it sort of from when you're live real time with all parties in the same room. And then, that's sort of a facilitation question for sure with good prep. But otherwise, yeah, there would be lots and lots of opportunity to signal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just many different conversations and reinforcing that, at any point in time, the process is completely voluntary and they can decide to change their mind. All right, thank you. We have another question in the chat from Ashley. How do you manage it when the needs or wishes of the directly harmed person conflict with the goal of having a community or system response? In other words, the harmed party wants this to be over and no community conversation versus the desire to involve a wider group of people for learning and healing.
that feels really situation specific. So I would want to, like, before saying something that, you know, sort of captures all situations of this, I don't think you can, I guess. But this particular process, the tier 2 facilitated process between two individuals, is going to be driven by the harmed person. So their willingness to entertain the idea to begin with, and if they are choosing this process, then it's up to the person who caused the harm to agree, yep, I'm willing to do that process. And it's really about them. It's not about, I mean, so things have community impacts, and I care very deeply about that. That's like actually what my work is now all about. So it's not that we don't care about that, but this particular process is about two people, or, it's named individuals and a specific harm. And so they get to decide what the process is about. That doesn't preclude that there aren't larger cultural, like, again, the tier 0 and the tier 1 work that can happen outside of the particular situation. So what are the broader issues related to this specific issue that the community would be wanting to identify as their concern? So they don't get to have a say over the situation between Vaughn and Ray, to take two names from our book. They don't get to say what, they think should happen in that case. But for them, what feels at stake more broadly is grad students and faculty. We need to talk about the dynamics in our department between grad students and faculty. And even more broadly, we need to talk about like power structures the whole way up, or something like that. Like, there are ways to have those conversations, I think, that can be really meaningful and lead to powerful change. And they shouldn't be ignored. Those opportunities shouldn't be ignored if the community is asking for that.
Yeah, I think it makes you think of one of our cases in point, page 40, the one about faculty climate concerns.
Mm-hmm.
I think, yeah, specifically, like, there are specific individuals who are having like uncomfortable experiences or less ideal experiences, and there's like the broader faculty climate that has to be involved so that it can be addressed and prevented going forward.
Yeah, so that there are separate processes, right? That you said address, the tier 2 addresses the sort of individual circumstances, the individual scenario, but that tier 1 and tier 0 definitely can involve the larger community.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question from John. It says, what are the institutional politics, power structures, and dynamics that are most conducive to implementing this well? RJ, and transformative justice seems to require a particular type of commitment or politics.
That's such a good question. Rachel, which chapter is that? Where we talk? I want to say it's chapter 8. Yes,
I think it's chapter 8.
Campus climate and culture. So yeah, we start with like the impact of institutional climate and culture play in successfully implementing any response to relationship violence or sexual misconduct, be it a whole school approach or a tier 2 process, and cannot be minimized or underestimated, because that's a different word. So I think that is very true, that there are particular types of commitments and politics that have to be navigated, but which ones are most conducive to implementing this well? Rachel, what do you think?
I mean, like, I guess there's so many levels at which this can be implemented. So, and there's so many factors involved. At a public institution, you're going to need to be thinking about state politics. You're going to have to think about state politics and how they impact what you can do in your student conduct office, like, for real. And you are, so We can talk about it sort of what needs to be in place for the whole school model to be implemented, but we can also talk about it in terms of what needs to be in place for a tier 2 response to be a possibility. I think in general, though, you've got to build coalition and broad-based support for something like this. And that can happen. Broad-based support for a tier 2 intervention can happen very naturally if you begin at tier 0 and tier 1, and then you build your tier 2 response. So that you're gaining the buy-in of the people that need to be on board. You're making sure that if this is that what you are developing for implementation on the ground is in alliance, is supports the values of the institution. If it's in complete contradiction from the values of the institution, it's gonna either not work or look very different. I'm thinking back to the question about prisons and what of this works in a prison setting. There's going to be certain parts of this that aren't going to apply, I'm guessing, but that's not my area of expertise. I'm thinking theoretically there would be some places where it's not a match. That doesn't mean you can't parts of it. But yeah, so I think making sure that the values of the institution are aligned with the broader restorative values is going to be important, or else if there's cognitive dissonance, you're just going to be wasting so much effort. And we all know that's it's a valuable commodity. So I don't know. That's a huge question. It's a huge question with so many different fingers that you could follow. So I don't know. What do you think, Mikayla?
Well, so what you said made me think about, I think what you said made me think exactly about, there was a state legislator at the National Restorative Justice Conference, and she said, anything can be changed or implemented as long as you find a point of common interest. So they were kind of talking about all of the political divisiveness and one side of the aisle versus the other side of the aisle. And she said, absolutely anything can be implemented and changed as long as you can find a good point of common interest and build from there. Like you said, coalition building and making sure that it's in alignment with shared values. So I agree. I think that's a great way to navigate complicated politics.
Patience, though. Start slow. Be creative. Blue sky thinking.
Absolutely.
And also bringing it down to what is the mutual benefit here?
Rachel, as you're talking about tier 0, one of the things that stood out to me most in reading this book was I love it and really admire when someone takes a pre-existing model and goes, something's missing here. Because you use the whole campus approach public health model that initially only had 3 tiers. And you added this tier 0. So I'm curious if, both of you can tell us a little bit more about that moment of insight or the conversations that led to this addition feeling absolutely essential. What in your experiences inspired you to say no, tier 0 is absolutely fundamental for this work?
You want to start, Mikayla?
Well, you're the one who brought tier 0 to the board.
Okay, so if you look at a public health approach more and more, and I don't know if it started after this book was written or before, but if you look up a public health approach, it will often say primordial level, and then primary, secondary, tertiary. So in RJ, we talk about tier 1, 2, and 3. So, just thinking, okay, so if we're talking in terms of tiers, and public health talks in terms of levels, the primordial level, that would be tier 0, So there was some of that sort of figuring that out. And then also from, there was an article that was published, and I feel like we reference it in the back in the book, and I can't remember exactly where it is, but it was just a very short paper like a 3-page paper about dentistry, like a dentistry setting, or what was it? Maybe you can search for it while I continue to talk. But that they talked about tier 0. So I would want to like say that little brief, that paper talked about it. And that paper was presented or referenced at a National Academy for Science, Engineering, and Math meeting that a colleague of mine went to. And he came back from that meeting and he was like, guys, I heard at this conference something that like gives language to what we are doing in our work. So I'm a prevention, I work in prevention with faculty, staff at a large university. And we're talking about like how to people as like the first step to creating conditions in which sexual misconduct is, we know what it is, and we can identify it when it's happening, and we know the conditions that cause it, and we're ready to take, the necessary steps. Then that looks like some just basic leadership development, some skill building around how to be civil, and a lot of that just doesn't happen. We are experts in our field in academia oftentimes, and not expert leaders. That doesn't mean, some academics are amazing leaders, but many of them get into a dean's chair or into a chair's chair, and they get there because they drew the short straw, or because that, they've been an expert in their field. And I've talked to many chairs that are like, I spend all of my time doing faculty to faculty negotiating. That is what I am doing now. And so how do we support that tier 0 community building, being really clear about our values and how that translates into how we want to interact with one another? So that was just some of our, like, how do we get upstream from this? We've got to have good ways of doing this in the moment so that people have agency to say what they want to have happen with their experiences, because so often what we must do has unintended consequences. We're being policy compliant, but in doing that, we are causing additional harm. So how do we give people options? And then Mikayla and I were just like, and how do we get ahead of this too? So that's where the tier 0 idea, we were like, okay, no one else has put this down in print that we know of. Feel free to take credit if you have. Because it was just, we were like hearing conversations. We saw a reference in a paper. Then we would check like the public health stuff. Some places were talking about primordial. And so anyway, that's kind of how the idea came together. But it does feel like something that is really, feels really meaningful to a lot of people that have read the book, as like, that's the new idea here, kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for bringing that all together for us. And it looks like we don't have any more questions in the chat, and we're coming up close to our time. So Mikayla and Rachel, I want to invite you. Do you have a final closing thought or words of wisdom that you want to leave us with?
Maybe our last slide.
Oh yeah.
I don't know if that screen is still shared. Is it still up there? So then going to the next one, if I still have access to that. Can you advance it for us, Erin?
I cannot, but John, are you able to advance it?
There we go.
There we go.
So I can read it, and then if you have any final thoughts, Mikayla, you can add those. Justice then is not dependent upon the law. That a society does not outlaw an activity does not mean that the activity is just. The more we act for the common good by being inclusive and letting others speak for themselves, the more we can learn about the people whom we ought to become. James Keenan.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that quote just feels like something worth coming back to over and over again as you navigate these hard things.
Yeah. Well, thank you both so much. I know that many of us on this webinar wish that there had been more supports in place for responding compassionately to sexual harms that we've experienced or witnessed on our college campuses. And this is such deeply needed transformative work. Thank you for putting your work out there to serve as a model for all of us. And to reference a quote that you chose from Angela Davis in the book, to encourage us to change the things we can no longer accept. Yeah. So thank you both for being here. And I'll turn it back over to John. We have
I need to unmute. Hi, everyone, again. Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar. Just a quick reminder to visit our zehrinstitute.org website, where there is an archive of previous webinars, some of which I had already linked during this webinar. But please, feel free to visit the site. And we love partners in this work. So there's a spot on the website to donate to this work, so that these wonderful webinars that give resources to all of us can continue. Thank you again, and thank you for taking in our fall season of webinars. We will see you in the spring. Bye all.